We're going to be talking about ancient floods in North America. Let's talk about floods first. Where do you want to start?
A place called Camas Prairie. In Camas Prairie, it's kind of a basin shaped. It's at the southern end of the Little Bitterroot Valley. The floor of it is mantled with these gigantic current ripples. Some of them are 40 and 50 feet high and 200 to 300 feet in wavelength, right? 40, that's a 4-story building.
Yeah, that's massive.
You're standing in the trough between them. You can't see over them. You're just looking at two big old hills. I've been through Camas Prairie many times, and I've taken groups there. If you stand in the right there in those ripples, they diminish in size from north to south. The basin is about 10 miles long. The ripples, they sort of diminish in size so that they can sort of taper out about 5 or 6 miles down from where they start.
So they're higher in the north. They're larger in the north.
They're higher in the north.
Okay.
Right. So, and the high water mark consistently was at 4,200 feet above sea level. Clark Fork River, 4,200 feet. Camas Prairie, 4,200 feet. Bitterroot Valley, 4,200 feet. Missoula Basin, 4,200 feet. So there was this consistent high water mark, right? So now you could gauge the depth by simply working from 4,200 feet down. So in Camas Prairie, the floor of Camas Prairie is 2,800 feet above sea level. It's 5 miles wide, so you got to picture a river 5 miles wide, 1,400 feet deep. It's probably moving at between 50 and 60 miles an hour.
Okay.
And the other thing that became apparent later is that these flood flows were supercharged with countless icebergs, which is also part of important piece of information to figure out what actually happened.
What happened in Palouse Falls, Washington?
You see the falls. Well, when you're looking at this, and we're looking south here in this photograph, we're looking down what's called Palouse Canyon. This canyon here was not produced by that water flow, right? That water flow is a minuscule remnant of the water flow that cut this landscape. Now, when the flow first came through here, this canyon didn't exist. The water flow was on top, and it was probably 200, 300 feet deep. As it swept over the land, it exploited weaknesses in the rock and then began to downcut the canyon. And what happens then is that the water that's flowing over the surface, once it begins to exploit a weakness in the rock, it begins to create this channel. The channel will then capture that water. And as it captures the water, the erosive potential of that flowing water increases enormously and then will quickly downcut. And so what you had here was a recessional cataract, it's called, because you have to picture that this entire landscape was submerged here at the peak of the flood. Then as the floodwaters began to decline, what you had happen was first the uplands would be above the floodwaters, and then over a period of probably several weeks, the water levels finally declined. Once the taps got turned off, the water source for this is coming from the north. I think it's coming mostly out of Canada, but we can look at some maps. Anyway, so then the water finally declines, it drains away. Once there's no more ice to melt, right, the floods are over. See, because this is all meltwater from the ice sheets that were here to the north. Because here, see, now you got to get this picture. You've got this huge body of water entrained in the mountains of western Montana. You can see that this whole view here would have been initially, at the early stages of the flood, this entire view would have been submerged. And where the falls is now, if the flood had kept on, if the water had kept sourcing from the north, the cliff, which is the cataract wall, it migrates upstream. Does that make sense? Because as the water is pouring over, just like what's happening at Niagara Falls, but on a much, much slower rate.
Sure, yeah.
It's migrating upstream because the water is essentially, the shear force of the water is pulling and plucking the rock off of the cliff face, which causes it to recede.
Sure.
And that's exactly what's happening here.
Okay.
Now, zoom out, and I want you to the big picture. Let's zoom out, keep going, and let's see, pause right there. Okay, so now, if you go over to the right of Palouse Falls, you're going to see a cliff there. That was a shoreline. So at one point, that gave you the full width of the water flow.
Okay.
So it was spread out much wider until it became channelized.
Right.
At that point, the channel captured the water flow.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, now if you back out more, you'll see one of the classical scabland features. Keep going.
And where on the west side? How far would it have gone to? So that was the
whole, pretty much the whole landscape to the left
would have been underwater.
Underwater.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Now, back out even more, Ryan. Okay. Now you stop there. Do you see the darker areas surrounded by lighter areas?
Yes.
Okay. Those darker areas are scars, gigantic scars in the landscape.
Okay.
And before the floods, this entire basalt plateau was covered with a type of soil called loess. In some places, it was 200 to 300 feet deep, sitting on top of the basalt bedrock. When those floods came from the north, the first thing they did was they swept away the 200 to 300 feet of loess.
And that would have been caused by millions of years of vegetation and just growth of forest, or growth of...
No, it's not forests.
Okay.
Because we're east of the Cascades. So this is a semi-arid environment.
Okay.
So it was deposition, probably by wind. The origin of this type of soil is still very controversial.
Okay, gotcha.
And it's worth a whole discussion in itself because it's very interesting stuff. Yeah. It's very fertile. Now, remember I said that the final floods of basalt were between 6 and 7 million years ago. Mm-hmm. So it's only post that the loess would have been accumulating on top.
Okay.
So now you'll see that the darker areas are places where the loess topsoil has been washed away to expose the darker basalt underneath.
Like the bedrock.
The bedrock, that's right. And yeah, Ryan is going right over the... And if you zoom in right where you're at, Ryan, where you were at with the... now go a little north, I'll stop there. Now you're going to see that there are islands of loess that would have been within the flows. Yeah, there we go. Those all would have been...
That's higher elevation that just didn't get touched by the water.
Well, initially it was submerged, but again, the thickness of that is a couple of 200 feet. Now, that's where I got when I said that the water was about 200 feet deep. It's because once it's gotten to the bedrock is about 200 feet lower than the original surface. Because look, you see against the horizon, you've got those truncated hills.
Right.
Okay, so that was a picture. Now we've got the bedrock exposed on the foreground. Mm-hmm. We've got the truncated hills, which is 200-foot thick loess topsoil. So what you actually have to visualize here is that this was like a huge river channel, and those were the banks of the river that we see over there against the horizon.
For how long? How long was this on the water?
Well, see, here's one of the interesting questions, and I'm guessing we're probably looking... See, there could have been multiple flows through here, but I think the primary flow was probably no more than a couple of weeks.
Okay.
And initially it would have been several 100 million cubic feet per second, and then that would have declined to whatever the modern Palouse River is now.
And I'm assuming the mainstream thinks that it was a different timeline than a couple of weeks?
Well, there's the controversy because, and we get a little bit complicated, but so this was like the birth, really, of the ice dam idea, that there was this ice dam in northern Idaho, the lake backed up against it, the ice dam broke and the lake rushed out to the west, flowed over the basalt plateau of eastern Washington, ultimately confluing at the Columbia Gorge and flowing out. In fact, there's a gigantic boulder delta that the city of Portland is built on. because the flood made a major, almost 90-degree turn to the north.
Yeah.
Right there where the Portland sits. Mm-hmm. The question is how many ice dams were there? Because the current view requires the area of Pend Oreille. The idea was that there was a lobe of ice that came from the north. You can actually see there's a valley just to the north of the lake. And then, that's called the Purcell Trench. Then we come over to the right, and there's a river valley coming up from the southeast. That valley right there is the Clark Fork Valley. Somewhere in there, the water, now the high water mark there, again, still 4,200 feet. But the valley floor is at 2,100 feet. So the water there was 2,100 feet deep. And the position of Lake Pend Oreille, the theory is there was an ice glacier there, and that glacier held in the water.
Okay.
The glacier gave way, and all that water gushed out, and you can see it cut a channel that goes down to the south there. So the Lake Pend Oreille occupies like a huge flood cut channel. And right there, about where it says Lake Pend Oreille, it's over 1,100 feet deep, the lake basin. And there's... It's a complicated thing between what the mainstream view is and what my alternative view is. But you asked for a succinct explanation. So the model now is that it became apparent early on that a single draining of this lake could not explain the whole complex of features throughout the Scablands.
Sure.
So the way around that was to begin amplifying the number.
Gradualism again.
Well, in a
Almost,
sense, yes.
Yeah.
So instead of one,
just over and over and over.
it happened over and over and over again.
For years and years and years.
Yeah, yes.
Yeah.
Whereas, and so there what it became is the source of the floods were all, and I'm using air quotes here, Lake Missoula.
Uh-huh.
I don't agree with that. I think that the source of the floods was north of here in Canada. Now, was there water in those mountain basins of western Montana? Absolutely there was. Did it rise up to 4,200 feet? Absolutely it did. But I don't think that was the origin of the floods. I think that was like a temporary holding basin because the topography, if you zoom out, Ryan. So Missoula, Montana was one of the basins of the lake. Now, at Missoula, Montana, the floor of the basin there where Missoula is right now is about 3,200 feet above sea level. And you can see very clearly on the mountains around it that 4,200 foot datum. So it means that right there in that basin, the water was 1,000 feet deep.
Okay.
Right, and I'm going to show you some slides when we shift over to the slides again. Now that we've seen the maps, this is a really good way to get the big picture. Right, if you go immediately south of there, Ryan, we're in the Bitterroot Valley. That whole valley there that you see right there was filled with water all the way to the south, and then it finally tapers off somewhere. I've gone and actually found the point where the water tapered off. I mean, if you follow the valley floor, what you're going to see is that at some point the valley floor gets to 4,200 feet above sea level. And at that point, you're at the shore of the lake, right? So the difference now between the standard view, the dominant view, is that you had this multiple damming and refilling of Lake Missoula. How I differ from that is that, okay, I'm just saying, okay, if you're telling me that's the origin of the flood, and that's the implication over and over again, that's what I disagree with. I think that the origin of it was rapidly melting ice sheets to the north.
But why did they rapidly melt?
Well,
that's the question.
Matt, you've just nailed the fundamental question right there.
Yeah.
So
Because, I mean, you're talking about a lot of water very quickly melting, and just pushing a ton of water.
I'm talking about 500 million to 1 billion cubic feet per second. Now, how the hell much is that?
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, it's insanity. You can't even comprehend it.
No, but I'll try to give you some handle. If you took every single river on every bit of flowing water on Earth,
Yeah.
every creek, every stream, every river. Think of all the big rivers. Think South America, Orinoco, the Amazon, North America, Mississippi, the Nile, the Congo, Missouri, the Rio Grande, the Colorado, the Hudson, the Mackenzie River, the Yukon River. Go over to Eurasia, the Po River, the rivers of China, all the rivers of the world. Take all of those flows all together. It's not even going to be 10% of one of these flows. The North American, there was 2 great ice sheets over North America. Now, we'll pull up a slide here shortly and you'll be able to see them. The Laurentide ice sheet was the big one. Imagine the ice sheet that's covering the South Pole being lifted up and set over North America, so the center of that is over what is now Hudson Bay. Then imagine that we take the ice sheet over Greenland, pick that up, bring it over, and set that down over the Canadian Rockies, and it reaches from northern Washington up to Alaska. You now have 2 massive ice sheets that combined are about the same size as Antarctica and Greenland put together. Take another Greenland-sized ice sheet, or maybe even a little bigger, and set over northwestern Europe. Now you're talking about a whole lot of glacial ice. Over Hudson Bay area, it's probably a good 1.5 miles thick, 7,000, 8,000 feet thick. We've got to come up with a way of melting a whole lot of ice really fast. And I think that I've got 2 candidates. Well, the 2 are, I think that my first choice would be, and let me qualify this by saying that when we look at the rates of sea level rise, which is going to be directly a function of the ice melting, because when all of that ice is sitting there piled up on the continents, oceans are going to be, and we know, are about 400 to 450 feet lower than now, which is extraordinary in itself. Well, so to get the ice there in the first place, where's that ice coming from? Well, it's water that's been evaporated from the oceans, precipitated out over land, and then it doesn't melt. It just keeps accumulating thicker and thicker and thicker, right? Mm-hmm. We know now that the onset of ice ages were extremely fast. The termination of ice ages were extremely fast. There's now evidence of 3 meltwater pulses into the oceans. So in other words, the rise of sea level from minus 400 to the current level was not a smooth uniform. It was pulsed, and in fact, it probably stopped and maybe even reversed during the Younger Dryas. But right. There was meltwater pulse 1A, which is dated at 14.6. Then it appears that there was another very rapid melting associated with the lower Younger Dryas boundary that is usually described as the draining of Lake Agassiz. So there was huge floods down the Mississippi into the Gulf of Mexico to the south. To the north, there was huge floods up what is now the Mackenzie River Valley into the Arctic Ocean. And then there was a final meltwater pulse at 11,600 years ago. So what I would speculate is that there were 3 very large melting events interspersed with smaller meltings, but something would have had to have triggered.
Right, each of the 3.
Each of the 3.
And potentially a different thing could have triggered each of the 3.
Of the 3. Now, What could those things? My first candidate would have been a multi-impact event. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And there is evidence from the lower Younger Dryas boundary that there was some type of impact event at just under 12,900 years ago.
To an impact event to the ice itself?
Well, see, that's the question. And I think that the answer to that is yes. I think that's what it's pointing us to.